My name is Ashley, and I have been a detective with the Metro Central Police Department for 9 years. I earned my shield through consistent case closures, maintained a spotless disciplinary record, and never questioned the locked sections of the basement that patrol officers joked about but never actually explored. That deliberate blindness ended 3 weeks ago when I went searching for a decades-old missing persons file and discovered a door that had no reason to exist, leading to a prison that had been operating beneath our feet for 40 years. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more breathtaking stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. It started with a file that refused to stay closed. The case was from 1987, a missing person named Christopher Valdez, who had been a patrol officer at this station before vanishing without explanation. His family hired a private investigator who submitted a records request, and somehow the request landed on my desk with a note from the records department. File misplaced, location unknown. Please retrieve from basement archives. I had been to the basement storage area at least 100 times, knew the layout by memory. Rows of gray metal shelving holding banker's boxes organized chronologically by case number, fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly, concrete floors painted industrial green to hide decades of scuff marks, standard evidence storage that every department maintains to satisfy legal retention requirements. I found the 1987 section easily enough and started scanning box labels for Christopher's case number. The box should have been on the middle shelf between 2 aggravated assault cases, but that space held a water damage incident report instead. I checked the surrounding boxes, thinking someone had reshelved it incorrectly, then expanded my search to the entire 1987 row. Nothing. I was about to head back upstairs and tell records the file was genuinely lost when I noticed the wall behind the shelving looked dimensionally wrong. Not damaged wrong, just spatially inconsistent with how I remembered the corridor ending. The concrete wall seemed closer than it should have been, like someone had shortened the room by several feet. I moved a few boxes aside and realized the entire shelving unit was mounted on industrial casters designed to roll. I grabbed the frame and pulled, and the unit glided aside with surprising ease, revealing a section of wall that had been hidden behind it. There was a door, not a maintenance access or utility panel, a full door painted the same gray as the concrete, nearly invisible when the shelving was positioned in front of it. No window, no label, no posted warnings, just a brushed steel handle that looked newer than anything else in the basement. I tried the handle. It turned smoothly, unlocked, clearly used with enough frequency that the mechanism didn't stick or protest. The door opened onto a stairwell descending into darkness far deeper than the building's foundation should have allowed. The station was constructed in 1982 on a single-level basement designed for storage and mechanical systems. I had seen the architectural plans during a facility safety training 2 years ago. There was no sub-basement on any blueprint, no secondary level indicated in any documentation. But these stairs went down at least another full story, disappearing into a space that violated every structural diagram I had ever reviewed. I descended slowly, flashlight cutting through air that grew colder with each step. Concrete walls showed moisture stains and rust patterns that suggested decades of existence, not recent construction. Motion sensor lights clicked on as I reached the bottom, illuminating a corridor that was clean, maintained, and clearly in regular use. The hallway stretched ahead with walls painted institutional beige and a floor worn smooth by foot traffic. 4 doors on the right side, all closed, all marked with numbers instead of labels. At the far end stood a larger door with a small reinforced window. I approached the first door and listened. Silence. Tried the handle. Locked. Moved to the second door with identical results. The third door was also locked, but the fourth door's handle turned. I pushed it open and found a small room containing a metal bed frame, a stainless steel toilet, and a person. A woman in her 30s sat on the bed, reading a book by the light of a single overhead bulb. She asked if I was here for the evening meal rotation or if this was another compliance interview. I asked her who she was and why she was locked in a room that shouldn't exist. She told me her name was Elena Morrison, and she had been a resident here for 19 months. I did not understand what resident meant in this context. She explained with unsettling calm that she had been a community organizer who filed multiple formal complaints about excessive force incidents in her neighborhood. Internal Affairs opened an investigation, and then 2 plainclothes officers appeared at her door one night, offering a choice. She could withdraw her complaints and sign an agreement promising silence, or she could accept protective relocation while the investigation proceeded. When she refused both options and contacted the ALC, they brought her here. I told her this was impossible, that police departments cannot detain citizens without charges or judicial process. She smiled without humor and suggested I check the other rooms, talk to the other residents, learn how long this facility had been operating before I decided what was legally possible. I left her room and tried the large door at the corridor's end. It opened into a communal space containing 12 beds arranged in rows, 8 of them occupied. The people in that room told me similar stories: witnesses to officer misconduct who wouldn't recant their statements, journalists investigating corruption allegations, activists who organized protests, a public defender who filed too many civil rights lawsuits, and officers, like Christopher, who refused to ignore what they had seen. All of them had been offered the same choice: cooperate and disappear from their own lives, or resist and disappear into this basement. No arrests, no court appearances, no communication with the outside world. Some of them had been here for months, others for years. One man said he had been counting days for nearly a decade. I backed out of the room trying to process the systematic horror of what I was witnessing, and walked directly into Captain David Reeves, my shift commander, and the officer who had written my recommendation for detective 3 years ago. He was not surprised to see me there. He said my name in a tone that suggested he had been waiting for this conversation to happen eventually, then gestured back towards the stairwell and told me we needed to talk in his office. Upstairs, behind his closed office door, Reeves explained the system with the same procedural tone someone might use to describe filing protocols. The underground facility had existed since 1984, created during a period when the department faced multiple lawsuits, federal oversight investigations, and public scrutiny that threatened to dismantle the entire organization. Command staff at the time decided certain problems needed to be removed from public visibility until they resolved naturally or the public attention moved elsewhere.
It started with a wall that didn't line up with the blueprints. I had walked past that section of the basement hundreds of times over 9 years. Storage cages filled with evidence boxes, old case files stacked in bankers' boxes that no one had touched since the department switched to digital records. Broken office furniture shoved against concrete walls, waiting for disposal that never came. Dead space. Dead space. The kind of maintenance crews avoided because it wasn't worth the effort to organize what nobody would ever need again. But standing there with Christopher Valdez's missing file request in my hand, something felt wrong about the geometry. The corridor should have ended at the exterior wall. I knew the building's footprint, had reviewed the floor plans during safety training, but the concrete wall in front of me sat at least 8 feet closer than it should have. The shelving unit against it looked permanent, bolted into place like it had been there since construction, except the floor beneath the casters showed wear patterns, movement patterns, drag marks in the painted concrete that suggested the unit had been repositioned repeatedly over years. I grabbed the metal frame and pulled. The entire shelving unit rolled aside with mechanical smoothness, revealing the door I described to Reeves. But I need to explain what happened after I opened it, because the descent changed everything I thought I understood about the building I had worked in for nearly a decade. The stairwell beyond that door was wrong, in ways that became more apparent with each step down. The stairs themselves were old. Not maintenance tunnel old, but architecturally old. Poured concrete worn smooth in the centers where feet had traveled for decades. The edges were chipped down to aggregate in places, exposing the gravel and sand mixture underneath. A metal railing ran along the left side, painted industrial green at some point, but now mostly rust, the surface slick with condensation that my hand came away wet from touching. The air changed immediately. Basement storage smelled like dust and old paper and the faint chemical odor of degrading evidence bags. This stairwell smelled of water and stone and something else underneath, something organic and stale that I couldn't quite identify, but that made my throat tighten instinctively. I descended slowly, flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than normal shadow. Particles floated in the light like dust, but finer, almost like ash or powder suspended in air that hadn't circulated properly in years. The temperature dropped with each step, going from the climate-controlled comfort of the basement storage to something damp and cold that made me wish I had grabbed my jacket from upstairs. 10 steps down, I stopped and looked back. The open door at the top showed the familiar fluorescent lighting of the basement, looking impossibly bright and normal compared to where I was standing. I could still go back, close the door, tell records the file was lost, forget I had ever noticed the dimensional inconsistency. Instead, I kept going. 15 steps. 20. The stairwell turned at a landing, descending another flight that put me at least 1 full story below the official basement level. Architecturally impossible, according to every document I had ever seen about this building. But my feet were on solid concrete, and my hand was on a rust-slicked railing, and the air was getting colder with each breath. At 30 steps, motion sensor lights clicked on ahead of me. The sound made me freeze mid-step, flashlight beams swinging up to catch the fixtures mounted along the ceiling of the corridor below. Industrial LED panels, recently installed based on their brightness and the lack of yellowing around the edges. Someone maintained this space. Someone paid the electrical bills. Someone cleaned the fixtures to keep them functioning. This wasn't an abandoned section forgotten by time. This was active infrastructure hidden beneath active infrastructure. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood at the entrance to a corridor that had no right to exist. The hallway stretched ahead for at least 40 feet, concrete walls painted institutional beige that looked fresh enough to have been done within the past year. The floor was smooth concrete, worn in the center from foot traffic, but clean. No debris, no dirt accumulation, no signs of neglect. Moisture stained the walls in places where groundwater had seeped through, but even those stains looked old and stable, not the kind of active water damage that would threaten structural integrity. 4 doors on the right side, spaced evenly, all closed, all marked with numbers stamped into metal plates beside the frames. 1, 2, 3, 4. No names, no labels, just numbers like hotels that wanted to remain anonymous. At the far end stood a larger door, different from the others, reinforced steel, with a small window set at eye level, the glass embedded with wire mesh, a security door, the kind designed to contain rather than provide privacy. I walked forward slowly, each footstep echoing in a way that made the space feel larger than it appeared. The motion sensor lights tracked my movement, panels clicking on ahead of me and shutting off behind, creating a bubble of illumination that moved with me through the corridor. I reached door number 1 and stopped, put my ear against the cold metal, listened. Breathing, faint but distinct. Someone was inside. I tried the handle, locked, a deadbolt that required a key I didn't have. Door number 2, same result, locked, the sound of movement inside, fabric rustling, but no response when I knocked lightly. Door number 3, also locked, But this time I heard a voice, muffled, indistinct, maybe talking to someone else in the room, or maybe just talking to themselves. Door number 4's handle turned. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges silent and well-maintained, and found myself looking into a cell. Not a room, not an office, a cell. 10 feet by 12 feet. Concrete walls painted the same institutional beige as the corridor. A single metal bed frame bolted to the floor, thin mattress and folded blanket on top. A stainless steel toilet in the corner with no seat, the kind installed in jail holding cells. A small metal sink mounted beside it. One overhead light fixture with a cage around the bulb. No window, no decoration, no personal belongings except a paperback book sitting on the bed. Elena Morrison sat on that bed, the book in her hands, looking at me like she had been expecting someone to open that door eventually. But I haven't told you yet what I saw before I found Elena. I need to go back to the moment the motion sensor lights clicked on, and I saw what was behind door number 5. Door number 5 wasn't in the corridor with the others. It was the reinforced door at the end, the one with the wire mesh window. After I left Elena's room with her disturbing explanation about being a resident, I walked to that door and looked through the small window before opening it. Iron bars. Not a door, not a wall. Bars. Vertical iron bars running floor to ceiling, like something from a historical jail, the metal thick and pitted with age, but still solid. And behind those bars, in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach, I saw movement. I turned the handle, unlocked, and pulled the door open. The room beyond was larger than the cells in the corridor, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling that rose 12 feet high. More motion sensor lights clicked on as I stepped inside, revealing a space that made my stomach drop. 12 beds arranged in 2 rows, metal frames identical to the one in Elena's cell. 8 of them occupied. The people in those beds reacted to the light like they had been living in darkness for so long that illumination had become painful. Hands shot up to shield eyes, bodies flinched away. Someone made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but wasn't anything else, just a noise of pure involuntary response. But then the recognition came. One by one they lowered their hands and looked at me with expressions I had seen before in my career, but never expected to see here. The desperate calculation that happens in a witness's eyes when they're deciding whether to trust a cop. The hope that fights against experience and usually loses. The assessment of whether the person standing in front of them represents rescue or just another kind of threat. A woman in her 50s stood up from the nearest bed, moving with careful slowness, whose body had adapted to limited space and minimal movement. She was wearing a cardigan that looked like it came from the early 2000s, acrylic fabric pilled from washing, style that hadn't been fashionable
in 20 years. Her hair was gray and cut short with unprofessional unevenness that suggested someone in this room did it for her with whatever tools they had available. Behind her, a younger man sat frozen on his bed, wearing a graphic T-shirt with a band logo I vaguely recognized from the 1990s. The fabric was faded gray from repeated washing, holes forming at the collar and hem. Another person stood at the back of the room, wearing clothes that looked even older, a windbreaker with color blocking that screamed 1980s, the synthetic material cracked and peeling at the shoulders. Different decades of fashion preserved in a room without seasons or trends or any connection to the outside world's progression of time. I swept the flashlight across the space slowly, documenting what I was seeing even as my brain struggled to process it. More beds, more people,
ages ranging from maybe 30 to possibly 70, though it was hard to tell because the artificial light and underground environment had done something to their skin, making them all look simultaneously too young and too old. No one spoke. They just watched me with that terrible combination of hope and certainty. Hope that I was different, certainty that I wasn't. I opened my mouth to say something, to identify myself as a detective, to explain that I didn't know this place existed, to promise that I was going to help them. But before I could speak, a man sitting on a bed in the second row leaned forward slightly. He was maybe 40, maybe 60, impossible to tell. He wore a button-down shirt that might have been blue once, but had faded to a color that wasn't quite gray and wasn't quite anything. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging past his shoulders in a way that suggested years of growth without access to regular haircuts. He looked me directly with eyes that were perfectly clear and perfectly aware of exactly what was happening, and he spoke in a voice that was quiet but steady. "You're new." Not a question, a statement, delivered with absolute certainty and no trace of hope. Because in that moment, he knew exactly what I was. Another person who discovered the secret, and now would have to make a choice about what to do with that knowledge. He had watched this moment play out before, watched other officers descend those stairs, open that door, see what was hidden below, and he knew that the discovery itself changed nothing. The system that put him in that cell survived every other person who found it, and now it would test whether it could survive me.
The man who said I was new didn't move from his bed. None of them moved. They sat or stood in positions that suggested they had learned to occupy minimal space, to make themselves small and unobtrusive, to exist without drawing attention even when attention was exactly what they needed. I stepped fully into the room, letting the door close behind me. The motion sensor lights overhead hummed faintly, the only sound besides my breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the walls. The air here was different from the corridor, not just cold and damp, but lived in. The accumulated smell of human habitation without proper ventilation, sweat and unwashed fabric, and the faint institutional odor of industrial soap. "How long have you been here?" I asked the man who had spoken. He tilted his head slightly, like he was calculating whether to answer. Then he said, 4 years, 3 months, approximately. He paused. I stopped counting weeks after the first year. The precision seemed less important after a while. 4 years. I had been a detective for 9 years. This man had been imprisoned in my department's basement for nearly half that time, and I had walked past the door hiding him hundreds of times without knowing. "My name is Ashley," I said, because I needed to say something that felt human and normal. "I'm a detective upstairs. I came down here looking for a file, and I stopped, realizing how absurd it sounded. I came down here looking for a file, as if that explained anything, as if that justified why it took me 9 years to find a prison operating directly beneath my workspace. "We know who you are," the woman in the dated cardigan said. She spoke carefully, precisely, like someone who learned that words needed to be measured and intentional. "My name is Catherine Torres. I was a civil rights attorney. I represented families in 3 excessive force cases against this department between 2018 and 2020. I won 2 of those cases. The settlements were substantial enough that the department's insurance premiums increased. After the 3rd case, I was approached by 2 officers who suggested I might want to consider referring future clients to different counsel. I refused. 1 week later, I was pulled over for a traffic violation I didn't commit and brought here for protective custody while an investigation into my professional conduct proceeded." She paused. That investigation has been ongoing for 5 years now. 5 years. Longer than the man in the faded shirt. Long enough that the outside world would have stopped looking for her. Long enough that people would have accepted whatever story the department told about where she went. "I'm Marcus Chen," said the younger man in the band t-shirt from the 1990s. He looked maybe 35, but the clothing suggested he had been here longer than his face did. "I was a graduate student studying police accountability and community oversight. I conducted interviews with citizens in this precinct about their experiences with law enforcement. My research documented patterns of misconduct that contradicted the department's official statistics. I presented preliminary findings at a conference in 2015. 3 weeks later, 2 plainclothes officers came to my apartment and told me there was a credible threat to my life from someone I had interviewed. They offered protective relocation. When I said I wanted to contact my academic advisor first, they brought me here instead." 2015. 10 years ago. He had been underground for a decade, while I was upstairs earning commendations and closing cases and believing I worked for an organization that operated within the law. The others began speaking then, one by one, stepping forward or remaining seated, but sharing their stories in voices that ranged from steady to broken to completely flat with emotional exhaustion. A journalist who investigated corruption in the evidence room, detained in 2012. An activist who organized protests after an officer-involved shooting, detained in 2017. A patrol officer who reported witnessing a fellow officer planting evidence, detained in 2019. A public defender who filed too many motions alleging constitutional violations, detained in 2020. A witness who refused to change testimony in a brutality case, detained in 2021. Each story followed the same pattern. Someone saw something, said something, documented something, or represented someone that threatened the department's carefully maintained image. Each person was approached with a choice framed as protective or procedural. Each person refused to cooperate or remain silent, and each person ended up in this room, processed through a system that existed parallel to law and entirely outside it. I listened until the stories blurred together into a single narrative of systematic suppression that had been operating beneath my feet for decades. Then I noticed the walls. The concrete had been marked in places, scratches, etchings, faint writing carved with something sharp or scratched with something broken. Names, mostly, dates occasionally, tally marks in some areas, counting time in groups of 5. Messages that ranged from desperate pleas to resigned documentation. Janet Morris, 8/3/98. They said 2 weeks. Remember my name, David Soto. 2,847 days. Tell my daughter I didn't leave. And there, near the back corner of the room, about 4 feet up the wall, scratched deep enough to be permanent. Christopher Valdez, police officer, badge 2847. I walked closer, kneeling to examine the etching. The letters were careful, precisely carved with something sharp enough to cut through paint and score the concrete beneath. Below his name was a date, March 15th, 1987, and below that, a single word, refused. Christopher Valdez, the missing persons whose file had brought me down here in the first place. The officer who had supposedly resigned from the department 38 years ago, according to official records. He hadn't resigned. He had refused. Refused to stay silent about something he had witnessed or learned or been asked to participate in. And the department had solved that problem by making him disappear into this basement the same way they disappeared everyone else who refused to cooperate. "You remember him," Marcus said from behind me.
It wasn't a question. "I've seen his name in old roster files," I said, which was true but inadequate. I had seen his name that morning on a records request form. I had been looking for his missing persons file when I found this place. The coincidence felt too deliberate, too precisely arranged. "He was already here when I arrived," Marcus continued. He tried to help the newer detainees understand the system, explained how meals worked, how medical visits were conducted, how to request specific items within the limited permissions were granted. He told us he had been an officer upstairs, that he had discovered evidence of corruption and tried to report it through proper channels. The chain of command brought him here instead. "What happened to him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be something I didn't want to hear. "He died 6 years ago, pneumonia that wasn't treated until it was too late. The medical visits are quarterly unless there's an emergency, and the definition of emergency is apparently quite flexible." Marcus's voice remained steady, factual, like he was describing administrative procedures rather than someone's death from medical neglect. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. Christopher Valdez had been a police officer, a colleague though decades before my time, and he had died in a cell beneath the station where he had once worked, while officers like me walked overhead completely unaware. "You keep saying they," I said, turning to face the room. "Who exactly is maintaining this? Who brings food? Who conducts the medical visits? Who decides who gets released and who stays?" Catherine Torres smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You'll meet them soon enough. The officers who staff this facility rotate on 3-month assignments. They don't volunteer. It's a rotation that comes with promotion opportunities and salary adjustments. Most of them don't enjoy it, but most of them do it anyway, because refusing the assignment means questioning why the assignment exists. And questioning why it exists means discovering what you just discovered, which means making a choice about whether to participate or end up on our side of the bars." "How many officers know?" I asked. "Most of the command staff, some senior detectives, officers who have been with the department long enough to either discover it accidentally, like you did, or be briefed into it intentionally as part of their advancement. The department has been operating for 42 years.
I left the communal
facility
cell
has
with
been
Catherine's
here for 41.
words echoing in my head. "You'll end up here with us," and walked back down the corridor toward the stairs. But halfway there, I noticed something I had missed during my initial descent. Another door, set into the left wall between the numbered cells, painted the same institutional beige as the concrete, and nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. No number, no label, just a keyhole and a handle. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked like the cells, but it turned easily. The door opened onto a smaller room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, lined with filing cabinets that looked like they had been installed in waves over decades. The older cabinets were olive green metal, with rust blooming at the corners. The newer ones were gray steel with electronic locks, but all of them shared the same feature: numbered labels instead of alphabetical organization. I pulled open the nearest drawer. Files, hundreds of them. Manila folders with coded labels typed on tabs. Alphanumeric sequences that meant nothing to me, but they clearly meant something to whoever maintained this system. I pulled one at random. CR872847V. Inside was a photograph of a young man in a police uniform, Christopher Valdez. His personnel file from upstairs included his badge number, assignment history, performance reviews, and commendations. This file contained different information. Subject: Christopher Valdez, police officer, badge 2847. Intake date: March 15, 1987. Reason for detention:
refusal to participate in evidence management protocol adjustments. Subject discovered irregularities in chain of custody documentation and filed internal complaint. Intervention attempted through supervisory counseling. Subject refused corrective guidance and threatened formal report to external oversight. Processing. Subject offered standard choice, relocation with compensation, voluntary resignation with severance, cooperative silence with promotion. Subject refused all options, classified as non-compliant, transferred to facility for indefinite protective custody pending resolution of internal investigation. Status: detained. Below that, a timeline of notes documenting his years in the basement, medical visits, behavioral observations, requests for reading material or specific foods, quarterly evaluations of his cooperation level that remained consistently marked non-compliant for 31 years until a final entry in 2018. Subject expired due to respiratory complications. Remains processed through standard removal protocol. File marked resolved. Resolved. I stared at that word until it stopped looking like language and became just shapes on paper. Christopher Valdez spent 31 years in a cell beneath the station where he had worked, and when he died from pneumonia that wasn't treated, the system documented his death as a resolution. I pulled another file, CR98441M, Janet Morris, the name I had seen scratched in the cell wall. A civilian who had witnessed an officer-involved shooting and refused to alter her testimony despite corrective counseling. Detained in 1998. Released in 2003 after signing an agreement documented in the file but not included in the folder. Status: resolved through cooperation. Another file, CR036182S, David Soto, community organizer who coordinated protests after a controversial use of force incident. Detained in 2003, no release date. Last entry from 6 months ago, noting his continued non-compliance and deteriorating health. Status: ongoing. I moved through the drawers systematically, pulling files at random and finding the same pattern repeated across 4 decades. Different names, different reasons for detention, but the same process, the same language, the same binary choice between cooperation and indefinite imprisonment. The earliest file I found was dated January 1984. A journalist named Patricia Chen, who had been investigating corruption in the department's contracting procedures. The intake documentation was less refined than the later files, handwritten notes instead of typed forms, less standardized language, but the essentials were identical. Subject detained for refusing to cease investigation. Subject offered relocation or silence. Subject refused. Transferred to facility. Her status was marked resolved, released 1989, with a note that she had signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and accepted a financial settlement in exchange for permanently leaving the state and ceasing all journalism work. I found the filing system's organizational logic after examining 20 files. The codes broke down into components: CR for the facility designation, followed by the intake year, a sequential number for that year, and a letter indicating the subject's category. V for department employees, M for witnesses and civilians, S for activists and organizers, J for journalists, L for attorneys. Each drawer was organized chronologically, creating a complete timeline of the facility's operation from 1984 to present. I counted the files in several drawers and did rough math based on the sequential numbers. Approximately 15 to 20 detentions per year for 41 years. Between 600 and 800 people had been processed through this basement. Some files were thin, a few pages documenting brief detention and quick resolution through cooperation. Others were thick with decades of documentation, quarterly evaluations, medical records, and behavioral notes that read like prison management reports. I found a separate filing cabinet labeled Administrative Protocols and pulled it open. Inside were binders containing the facility's operational procedures, written in the same bureaucratic language as any other department manual. Detention Facility Operations Manual, revised 2019. The introduction explained the facility's purpose with clinical detachment. This facility provides secure administrative detention for individuals whose continued presence in public circulation represents a material threat to departmental operations, legal defense posture, or institutional stability. Detention is authorized when standard corrective measures, counseling, reassignment, financial incentive, legal action prove insufficient to ensure subject cooperation, and when the subject's knowledge or testimony threaten to create liability exposure exceeding acceptable risk thresholds. Acceptable risk thresholds, as if imprisoning people without charges or trial was a risk management strategy rather than a crime. The manual outlined feeding schedules, 3 meals daily, prepared by rotating kitchen staff who believed they were providing food for overnight holding cells in the legitimate holding cells upstairs. Medical protocols, quarterly wellness checks conducted by department physicians who documented their visits as contractor facility inspections. Psychological management techniques, isolation schedules, communication restrictions, graduated privilege systems designed to break resistance and encourage compliance. There was an entire section on resolution pathways, explaining the 2 ways someone left the facility. Cooperative resolution. Subject signs comprehensive non-disclosure agreement with financial settlement and relocation assistance. Subject accepts monitoring and periodic check-ins to ensure continued compliance. Subjects are released through cooperative resolution and reclassified as resolved, and files transferred to archive storage. Non-cooperative resolution. Subject remains in facility until natural expiration, at which point remains are processed through external contractor and documented as unrelated death, accident, medical emergency, suicide, etc., occurring outside department jurisdiction. Family notification handled through standard missing persons protocols. Files marked resolved and transferred to archive storage. Natural expiration. They had created a euphemism for letting people die in captivity. I found sections on facility maintenance, utility management, and staff rotation. The manual explained that officers were assigned to facility duty in 3-month rotations as part of their promotional track. Refusal of facility assignment required justification and typically resulted in assignment to less desirable positions. The system incentivized participation by tying career advancement to willingness to maintain the facility.
The detainees could be released. Justice could be... I stopped that thought before it could fully form, because I already knew what the manual had explained, what Catherine and Marcus had tried to tell me upstairs, what every fiber of institutional logic made clear. This system had survived for 40 years specifically because it had protocols for managing exposure attempts. These files wouldn't leave this basement if I carried them upstairs. They would disappear. I would disappear. And someone else would discover this place eventually and face the same choice I was facing now. I pulled open one more drawer, looking for the oldest file in the system, and found instead a binder labeled Historical Documentation, Facility Origin. Inside were photographs. Construction photos from 1983 and 1984 showing the basement excavation, concrete pouring, bar installation, cell construction,
The photos were labeled with dates and contractor names, documenting the building of this prison beneath the station, while the station operated normally overhead. There were also photographs of the first detainees, names I didn't recognize, faces frozen in Polaroid moments that showed their transformation through initial detention, through months and years of captivity. The progression was visible. Defiance giving way to resignation, anger dissolving into exhaustion, humanity compressing into survival. The final photograph in the binder showed a group of men in suits standing in the completed facility. I recognized some faces from old department photos hanging in the upstairs hallways, command staff from the 1980s, city officials, the mayor who had approved the initial proposal. They were smiling. Standing in front of completed cells, surrounded by the infrastructure of systematic imprisonment, and they were smiling like they had just cut the ribbon on a new community center. I closed the binder and looked around the records room one final time. Every drawer, every file, every page of documentation represented a choice someone had made to prioritize institutional protection over human rights, legal integrity, and basic morality. And somewhere in this room, there would eventually be a file with my name on it. The only question was whether that file would be marked resolved through cooperation or ongoing, non-compliant. I turned toward the door and found the same word staring back at me from the label on the final filing cabinet. Resolved Cases, Archive Storage, 1984-2023. Resolved. 40 years of imprisoned lives reduced to a single bureaucratic word that meant nothing and contained everything. I pulled open the archive drawer and saw hundreds of files, each one representing a person who had either cooperated into silence or died into resolution. The word appeared on every file tab: resolved, 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 resolved. A rhythm of institutional erasure that had been playing on repeat for 4 decades beneath the police station where officers like me walked every day without hearing it. Until now. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were directly behind me. The records room had insulated me in silence, just the hum of my own breathing and the rustle of paper as I moved through decades of documented imprisonment. But when I turned from the archive cabinet with its endless repetition of resolved, I became aware of a presence in the doorway that felt like it had been there for some time, watching and waiting. Captain David Reeves stood with one shoulder leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely over his chest, his expression carrying neither surprise nor concern. He looked exactly as he had that morning when I'd seen him in the upstairs briefing room, pressed uniform, clean-shaven, the slight graying at his temples that gave him an air of distinguished authority. He looked like a man who had stopped by to check on routine administrative work, not someone who had just found a detective discovering a secret prison. "Ashley," he said, my name delivered in a tone that suggested he had been expecting to say it eventually, not today necessarily, but someday, as if my presence in this room was inevitable rather than shocking. I stepped back reflexively, my hand moving toward my service weapon before I caught myself. Drawing on my commanding officer in a basement records room, that was the kind of action that would end my career, even if everything else I had seen tonight turned out to be a nightmare I could wake up from. "Captain," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, "I can explain." "You don't need to explain," he interrupted gently. "I know exactly why you're down here. Records sent up a request inquiry about the Valdez file 3 hours ago. I knew you'd go looking for it eventually. Old missing persons cases have a way of drawing attention from thorough detectives. That's part of how the system works." Part of how the system works. He said it the way someone might explain office filing procedures or evidence logging protocols, casual, matter-of-fact, completely absent of the horror that should accompany the discovery of illegal detention. "You knew I'd find this?" I said, and it wasn't a question. "I knew someone would find it eventually. Good detectives follow trails. They notice inconsistencies. They push past obstacles until they understand what they're looking at. That's part of how they make them valuable to the department." He shifted his weight, settling more comfortably against the doorframe. "It's also what makes them occasionally inconvenient." The word inconvenient hung in the air between us like something toxic. People imprisoned for decades were inconvenient. Officers who discovered the truth were inconvenient. Constitutional rights were apparently inconvenient when they interfered with institutional self-preservation. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "I was briefed into the facility 6 years ago when I made captain. Before that, I suspected something existed. You work here long enough, you notice patterns. Officers who ask too many questions getting transferred suddenly. Civilians who file complaints disappearing from public view. Cases that should have gone to trial getting resolved quietly. You notice, or you choose not to notice." He paused. "I chose to notice, which meant eventually I got briefed instead of transferred." "And you just accepted it? You saw what's down here and decided it was fine?" "I decided it was necessary." His voice remained calm, almost gentle, like he was trying to help me understand something difficult but important. "You've read the files. You've seen the timeline. This facility has existed for 41 years because it solves a problem that no one has found a better solution for. What happens when someone threatens to destroy the department through testimony or publicity or litigation? What happens when the alternative to detention is institutional collapse that affects thousands of officers and millions of citizens who depend on law enforcement? You charge them with a crime if they've committed one, or you let them exercise their constitutional rights if they haven't," I said, knowing how naive it sounded even as I said it. "In an ideal system, yes, but we don't operate in an ideal system. We operate in a system where public perception determines funding, where media coverage determines policy, where individual complaints can trigger federal oversight that cripples operational effectiveness. This facility exists because someone decided 40 years ago that protecting the institution was more important than individual rights." He said it without defensiveness or apology, just fact. "You can disagree with that decision. Most people do when they first learn about it. But disagreeing doesn't change the reality that the decision was made and implemented and has been maintained by hundreds of officers over 40 decades. I thought about the photographs I had seen in the historical documentation binder, command staff smiling in front of completed cells, city officials approving budgets that hid operational costs, generations of officers participating in rotation assignments that kept the facility staffed and functioning. David was right about one thing. This wasn't a conspiracy maintained by a handful of corrupt individuals. This was institutional policy perpetuated by systemic participation. "These people haven't committed crimes," I said. "They filed complaints. They testified truthfully. They investigated corruption. Those are legal activities protected by the First Amendment." "They threatened the department's ability to function," David replied. "Sometimes those two things overlap in ways that create impossible choices. You can prioritize individual rights and watch the institution collapse under litigation and oversight and public scandal, or you can prioritize institutional survival and find ways to manage the individuals who threaten it. Command staff 40 years ago chose survival. Every administration since then has maintained that choice. By imprisoning innocent people? By detaining problematic individuals until they become less problematic. Most of them get released eventually.
You saw the files. Cooperative resolution is the most common outcome. People sign non-disclosure agreements, accept financial settlements, relocate to other cities, and move on with their lives. They're not happy about it, but they're free. The OC only becomes permanent for people who refuse to cooperate. People like Christopher Valdez, I said, who died in a cell after 30 years because he wouldn't stay silent about corruption? Something shifted in David's expression, not guilt exactly, but acknowledgement that Christopher's case was harder to justify than others. Christopher's situation was regrettable. He was a good officer who made a choice that left the department with limited options. He could have accepted promotion and stayed silent. He could have resigned with severance. He could have signed an agreement and relocated. He chose none of those options, which meant he stayed here until his natural death. Natural death. The same euphemism from the operations manual, as if dying from untreated pneumonia in a basement cell was somehow natural, rather than the direct result of medical neglect. "This is insane," I said, my voice rising despite my effort to maintain composure. "You're describing systematic human rights violations, like they're reasonable administrative procedures. People are imprisoned without charges, without trial, without any legal process whatsoever, and you're justifying it as institutional necessity?" "I'm explaining it as institutional reality," David corrected. "You can call it insane. You can call it immoral. You can call it whatever helps you process what you're learning. But calling it names doesn't change the fact that it exists, that it's operating successfully for 40 decades, and that you've now become part of the small group of people who have to decide what to do with that knowledge." He pushed off from the doorframe and took a step into the records room, not threatening exactly, but occupying space in a way that reminded me he was my commanding officer and I was a detective who had just discovered something I wasn't supposed to know about. "This happens to every good officer eventually," David said. "The thorough ones, the ones who follow procedures and ask questions and notice inconsistencies, they find this place. Or they find something else that leads them to uncomfortable truths about how the department actually functions. And when they find it, they have to make a choice about who they want to be." "What choice?" I asked, though I already knew from reading the operations manual and talking to the detainees and seeing the progression of files in the cabinets. Whether to prioritize idealism or reality, whether to destroy their career and accomplish nothing, or adapt their understanding and continue being effective, whether to end up in a cell themselves, or become someone who helps maintain the system that creates those cells. He said it without apparent judgment, like he was explaining options on a benefits enrollment form. "And the people who don't choose adaptation? You've met them. They're in the cells." The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any threat could have. The system didn't punish resistance through violence or intimidation. It punished resistance through the same mechanism it had created.
That's not a choice. Call it what you like. The outcome is the same. You'll decide in the next few hours whether to adapt your understanding of how this department functions or experience that functioning from the other side of the bars. He gestured back toward the doorway. But that decision doesn't need to happen in this records room. You've seen enough down here. You understand the situation. The next conversation should happen somewhere more comfortable. He turned and walked toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing against concrete in a way that suggested he expected me to follow. Halfway to the door, he stopped and looked back. "We should talk upstairs," he said, his tone carrying the same casual certainty he might use to suggest grabbing coffee or reviewing case files. "My office, where we can discuss this properly." As if this were routine.
as if discovering illegal imprisonment and being offered a choice between complicity and detention was just another administrative matter to be handled through proper channels. As if the decision about whether I would spend the rest of my career helping maintain a torture facility or spend the rest of my life imprisoned in one was something that required nothing more than a calm conversation in a supervisor's office. He walked toward the stairs without waiting for confirmation that I would follow. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run or fight or refuse, I found myself walking after him. Because he was right about one thing. There were only two outcomes once you discovered this place, and I was about to find out which one would be mine.
David's office looked exactly as it had every other time I had been summoned there. Third floor, corner position, with windows overlooking the parking lot, standard issue desk with organized stacks of paperwork, framed commendations on the walls documenting a career built on competence and institutional loyalty. The only difference was context. Yesterday, this had been my supervisor's office. Today, it was an interrogation room where my future would be decided. David closed the door behind us and moved to his desk without urgency, settling into his chair with the relaxed posture of someone conducting a routine performance review. He gestured toward the chair opposite, the same chair where I had sat 3 years ago when he told me my promotion to detective had been approved. I remained standing. "Sit," he said, not as an order, but as a suggestion delivered with the certainty that I would comply eventually. "This conversation will take some time, and there's no benefit to conducting it while you're exhausted and standing." I sat, partly because my legs were unsteady, and partly because refusing felt like a gesture that would accomplish nothing except announcing my defiance before I had decided whether defiance was even possible. David opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Not a thin folder suggesting recent creation, but a thick one, with pages that had been accumulated over time. He set it on the desk between us, angled so I could see the label typed on the tab. My name, Detective Ashley Morgan. Not a file I had created, a file that had been created about me. Every officer who demonstrates the qualities we value eventually develops a tracking file, David explained, his tone educational rather than threatening. Intelligence, thoroughness, attention to detail, unwillingness to accept superficial explanations, those qualities make excellent detectives. They also make officers who eventually discover things they weren't supposed to know about. So we track people who exhibit those qualities and prepare for the moment when discovery becomes inevitable. He opened the folder and turned it so I could see the contents. The first page was my personnel file, hire date, assignment history, performance evaluations, commendations, standard information that existed in the department's official records. But beneath that were pages I had never seen before. Incident reports documenting moments when I had asked questions about irregularities in case files, supervisor notes tracking my tendency to follow procedural inconsistencies to their source, observations about my request patterns when accessing old records, a timeline mapping my growing familiarity with the basement storage area and the frequency of my visits to archives that most detectives never bothered to examine. "You've been to the basement 47 times in the past 18 months, David pointed to a spreadsheet tracking my access badge swipes. Most detectives go maybe 5 or 6 times per year. Your pattern suggested unusual caseload requirements or natural curiosity about departmental history. We flagged you as someone who would likely discover the facility within the next year. You've been watching me. We've been documenting you. There's a difference. Watching implies active surveillance. Documentation is passive observation of patterns that reveal character.
Your patterns revealed someone who wouldn't stop searching once they noticed something wrong. That made you either a future asset or a future problem, depending on how you responded to discovery. He pulled another page from the folder, a psychological evaluation I didn't remember taking, though the date indicated it was administered during my promotional process 3 years ago. Sections were highlighted in yellow. Strong sense of justice and procedural integrity. Difficulty accepting authority directives that conflict with personal ethical framework. Demonstrates loyalty to institutional mission but may struggle with compartmentalization when faced with systemic contradictions. The department psychologist flagged you as someone who would have difficulty reconciling idealism with reality, David said. That's not uncommon. Most officers enter the profession with idealistic motivations that gradually erode through experience, but some people resist that erosion more strongly than others. You're in that category, which meant we needed to prepare for the possibility that discovery would lead to resistance rather than adaptation. He turned several more pages, showing me reports I didn't know existed. A note from a supervisor documenting my questions about a case that had been resolved too quickly. An observation from a senior detective about my tendency to push for answers even when told to drop inquiries. A memo from the records department noting my unusual interest in historical missing persons files. Every moment where I had demonstrated curiosity or persistence had been recorded and analyzed as potential evidence of future non-compliance. "This is insane," I said, my voice barely controlled. "You're treating detective work, actual police work, as if it's suspicious behavior." "We're treating thorough investigation as an indicator of character that requires management," David corrected. "Most officers develop an understanding over time that certain questions don't need answers, that certain inconsistencies aren't worth pursuing, that institutional functionality sometimes requires accepting gaps in logic. You haven't developed that understanding naturally, which suggested you would need direct intervention once you discovered something that couldn't be dismissed or ignored." He reached into the drawer again and pulled out 2 documents, placing them side by side on the desk. Both were official department forms, both had my name typed in the relevant fields, and both were dated today. The left document was a promotion approval form. Detective first grade, salary increase of 18%, assignment to the Criminal Investigations Division with supervisory responsibilities, effective immediately. Already signed by David and the deputy chief, awaiting only my signature to become official. The right document was a detention authorization form, the same format I had seen in the basement records room. Subject name, Detective Ashley Morgan. Reason for detention, discovery of classified facility with refusal to maintain operational security. Processing, subject to be offered standard resolution options with detention authorized if non-compliance persists. Status, pending subject cooperation assessment. "These are your 2 files," David said simply. "One gets processed if you demonstrate understanding. The other gets processed if you demonstrate resistance. Both are already prepared because we knew this moment would come eventually, and preparation is how institutions survive unexpected developments." I stared at the documents, trying to process the calculated horror of what he was showing me. My promotion hadn't been earned through merit and then offered as an incentive for silence. It had been prepared in advance, specifically as the reward for choosing complicity. And my detention hadn't been created as a threat in response to my discovery. It had been drafted as a procedural inevitability if I chose wrong. "You knew I would find the facility," I said slowly. "You knew when. You prepared both outcomes before it even happened." "We knew someone would find it eventually, and we knew you were a likely candidate based on your patterns. The specific timing was unpredictable, but the discovery itself was inevitable. So yes, we prepared both responses, because that's what institutions do when they know a problem is coming. They develop contingency plans for multiple outcomes. He pushed the promotion form closer to me. This is the outcome we prefer. You accept the reality of the facility. You sign an agreement to maintain operational security. You take a promotion that both rewards your silence and increases your stake in the department's continued stability. You become part of the institutional structure that protects the facility rather than threatens it. "And what if I refuse?" I asked. "Then this becomes official," he said, tapping the detention authorization. "You're processed through the same procedure you saw documented downstairs. You're offered standard resolution options, and when you refuse all three, and we know you will refuse because your psychological profile indicates you don't compromise on perceived moral absolutes, you're transferred to the facility for protective custody pending resolution of the security breach you represent." "Security breach?" I repeated. "You mean knowing that you imprison innocent people?" "I mean possessing knowledge that could damage the department if disclosed to unauthorized parties. That's the operational definition of a security breach, regardless of whether the underlying information involves legal activities or protected ones." He leaned back in his chair, studying my face with an expression that might have been concern or might have been clinical assessment. "Do you think you're the first person to sit in that chair and hear this explanation? You're the 9th officer I've personally conducted this conversation with. 6 of them signed the promotion paperwork."
"You could try," David interrupted gently, "and you would fail, just like the 17 people who tried before you failed. The facility has protocols for managing exposure attempts. Your evidence would be discredited, your contacts would be intercepted, your credibility would be destroyed through documented mental health concerns, or substance abuse problems, or financial improprieties that would suddenly surface during the investigation. And then, when exposure had been prevented, and your attempt had been documented as the security breach we knew it would be, you would be processed as a resident." He pulled one more document from my file, a preliminary psychological evaluation dated today, already completed and signed by the department psychologist. The summary paragraph was visible. "Officer demonstrates signs of acute stress response and reality dissociation following discovery of classified operational facility. Recommend immediate administrative leave with mandatory counseling. Officer poses risk to self or others if allowed to remain in active duty without intervention." This evaluation was completed this afternoon while you were downstairs, before we even have this conversation. It's already in the system, already part of your official record. If you attempt to disclose what you've learned, this evaluation becomes the foundation for discrediting your claims. Stress response, reality dissociation. The department would express concern for your well-being while ensuring nobody takes your allegations seriously. The systematic preparation was somehow more horrifying than the facility itself. They hadn't waited to see what I would do. They had already documented me as potentially unstable, already created the narrative that would destroy my credibility if I chose resistance. The choice David was offering had been decided before I ever discovered the basement. The only question was which pre-written outcome would become official. How many officers know about this? How many people are walking around upstairs maintaining this system? Command staff entirely, senior detectives mostly, patrol officers in selective cases, maybe 30 to 40 people at any given time, though the number fluctuates with retirements and promotions. It's not a majority of the department, but it's enough institutional participation that the system sustains itself through generational transfer. New command staff get briefed, new senior detectives get tested, new participants get recruited. The facility continues operating regardless of personnel changes because it's structural rather than individual. 30 to 40 officers maintaining illegal imprisonment. Not a conspiracy requiring secrecy, but an institutional practice requiring only selective participation and collective silence. David slid the promotion form directly in front of me and produced a pen from his desk drawer. This isn't punishment, Ashley. Refusal isn't being treated as a crime that requires detention. It's being treated as a security breach that requires management. If you were being punished, you wouldn't be offered promotion. You're being offered a choice between institutional reality and personal idealism, with consequences that follow naturally from either option. He set the pen on top of the form. Sign this and accept that the department you work for is more complicated than you wanted to believe, or refuse and experience that complication from the other side of the bars. I looked at the pen, at the signature line, at the promotion I had earned and that was now being offered as payment for complicity. And I realized the choice hadn't been decided today or yesterday or even when they first started tracking the basement visits. The choice had been decided 41 years ago when someone first decided that institutional survival justified systematic imprisonment. Everything since then, every officer who discovered the facility, every detainee who was processed, every promotion that was offered, every detention that was authorized, was just the system perpetuating the choice that had already been made. I wasn't being given a choice. I was being processed through a system that pretended choice existed while ensuring only one outcome was acceptable. David watched me stare at the pen with an expression of patient certainty, like he already knew which file would be processed. He had prepared both outcomes, but he had only expected one.
"I need to see them again," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "The detainees, before I decide." David studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, as if this request was expected, perhaps even part of the process he had guided other officers through before me. "That's reasonable," he said, standing and retrieving keys from his desk drawer. Most officers who reach this point need to reconcile what they've learned with the human reality of what maintaining it means. Seeing them again sometimes helps clarify which choice is actually survivable. He said it like he was offering therapeutic guidance, rather than escorting me back to a prison so I could look at the people I would either help keep imprisoned or join in captivity. We walked through the station in silence. Third shift was thin, a few patrol officers processing paperwork, a desk sergeant reviewing reports, a janitor emptying trash cans in the hallway. Normal operations continuing normally while two officers walked toward a stairwell that led to systematic human rights violations. None of them looked up. None of them noticed. Or maybe they had learned the same lesson David was trying to teach me, that some things in this building required not noticing. The basement was dark, except for emergency lighting. David led me past the storage cages and evidence lockers to the section where the mobile shelving unit concealed the hidden door. He pulled the unit aside with practiced ease, the movement smooth and familiar, clearly something he had done many times before. The door opened onto the same stairwell I had descended hours earlier, though it felt like days had passed since then. The air was still cold and damp, still carried that organic staleness that spoke of confined human habitation. The motion sensor lights clicked on as we descended, tracking our movement down into the architectural impossibility beneath the station. At the bottom, David walked ahead of me toward the large reinforced door at the end of the corridor. He unlocked it with a key from the ring he carried, pulled it open, and gestured for me to enter first. The communal holding area was darker than before, the overhead lights dimmed to what must have been their nighttime setting. But there was enough illumination to see the beds, the figures on them, and the moment when those figures registered David's presence. The change was immediate and visceral. Bodies that had been resting tensed, faces that had been relaxed or sleeping snapped toward the door with expressions that cycled rapidly through recognition, fear, and resignation. Someone made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a whimper, but something between them that conveyed involuntary dread. They knew him. They knew what his presence meant. Catherine Torres sat up slowly on her bed, her eyes moving from David to me and back to David. Her face carried no hope now, none of the careful dignity she had maintained during our earlier conversation, just exhaustion and recognition of a moment she had witnessed before. "You brought her back," Catherine said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Detective Morgan requested to see the facility again before making her decision," David replied, his tone remaining calm and professional. "I'm providing her with the opportunity to understand the full scope of what she's choosing between." Marcus Chen stood from his bed in the back row, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone who had learned not to make sudden gestures around authority. "This is the part where you show her what happens if she refuses, isn't it? Where you let her see us react to your presence so she understands that choosing resistance means becoming like us, people who are afraid of their jailers. I'm showing her reality. You're part of that reality. Your responses are your own." "Our responses are conditioned," Marcus countered, his voice carrying an edge, despite the evident fear in his posture. "We've learned to be afraid because being afraid is the rational response to years of captivity with no legal recourse and no timeline for release. You're using our fear as a teaching tool for her, the same way you've used it for every other officer you've brought down here." David didn't deny it. He simply stood near the door, allowing the scene to speak for itself. The frightened detainees, the institutional control, the systematic power imbalance that made resistance seem futile and compliance seem necessary. I looked at the faces in that room and understood with sudden clarity that this moment had been repeated for decades. How many officers had stood where I was standing, looking at imprisoned people who represented the cost of choosing idealism over institutional loyalty? How many had been brought back to this room specifically to witness the fear their superiors could invoke, the control they could exercise, the permanence of the consequences for non-compliance? "How many officers have you brought here?" I asked David, though I already knew the answer would be precise. He's someone who tracks such things. "9, including you. It's part of the decision-making process for officers who demonstrate uncertainty. Some officers sign the promotion paperwork immediately after learning about the facility. They process the information quickly and adapt their understanding without requiring additional exposure. Others need to see the human reality again before they can reconcile what cooperation means." He gestured around the room. "This is what cooperation maintains. These people remain here because officers like me, and potentially officers like you, choose institutional preservation over individual justice." "You're trying to make me feel responsible for them," I said. "You are responsible for them, not for their initial detention. That happened before you knew this place existed, but for their continued detention going forward. If you accept the promotion and maintain security, you become part of the system that keeps them here. If you refuse and get detained yourself, you become part of what the system contains. Either way, your choice affects their reality." A woman I hadn't spoken with before, older, maybe 60, with gray hair and hands that trembled slightly, spoke from a bed near the middle of the room. "Don't let him manipulate you with our suffering. He's trying to make you think that accepting his offer somehow helps us, that your compliance is a form of protection. It's not. Whether you sign his papers or join us in these cells, we remain here exactly as we are. The only thing your choice affects is whether you can live with yourself afterwards." "That's not entirely true," David said calmly. "If Detective Morgan refuses and gets detained, the department will need to process another officer through discovery eventually. The facility gets exposed to another person who will face the same choice, creating another opportunity for security breach. Whereas if she accepts promotion and maintains security, the facility remains stable with one fewer point of potential exposure.
Her cooperation reduces risk, which benefits everyone, including the detainees, whose circumstances would become significantly worse if the facility was exposed prematurely. Prematurely? I turned to face him. You're talking about this place like it's going to be revealed eventually, like there's a plan for shutting it down. There's no plan, but there is inevitability. Systems like this don't last forever. Eventually, something changes. Political environment, legal precedent, technological surveillance that makes concealment impossible. When that change comes, the facility will be dismantled and the detainees will be released with whatever cover story minimizes liability. But that change has to happen from external forces, not from internal exposure attempts that would destroy the department and accomplish nothing except chaos. So your argument is that I should cooperate in imprisoning innocent people because eventually, maybe, circumstances might force the department to stop imprisoning innocent people? The absurdity of the logic would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so horrifying. My argument is that your individual resistance accomplishes nothing except your own destruction. The facility survived 17 exposure attempts over 40 years. It will survive yours. The only question is whether you survive the attempt or become another cautionary tale for the next officer who discovers what you've discovered. David moved closer, his voice taking on a tone that might have been genuine concern or might have been sophisticated manipulation. You think you're choosing between justice and complicity, but you're actually choosing between futile self-destruction and pragmatic survival. The facility exists regardless of your choice. The detainees remain detained regardless of your choice. The only variable you control is your own outcome. I looked around the room at faces that had heard variations of this argument before, that had watched this moment play out with other officers who stood where I was standing and faced the same manufactured choice between cooperation and imprisonment. What did the others choose? I asked David. The 6 officers who signed the promotion paperwork, do they sleep well at night knowing they're helping maintain this? They sleep the same way I sleep, by understanding that individual officers don't create institutional systems. We only choose whether to participate in systems that exist with or without us. By accepting that moral purity is a luxury that requires privilege most people don't have. By recognizing that sometimes the most responsible choice is the one that allows you to continue functioning within a flawed system, rather than destroying yourself trying to fix what can't be fixed by individual action. That's not morality, that's rationalization. Call it what you like, the outcome is the same. Those 6 officers are still working, still supporting families, still contributing to legitimate law enforcement while maintaining security around one problematic aspect of the institution, whereas the 3 who refused are in cells, accomplishing nothing except their own suffering. Catherine stood from her bed, moving slowly toward the bars that separated the holding area from where David and I stood. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "He's right about one thing,"
she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Your choice won't free us. We've been here too long, know too much, represent too much liability. Even if you exposed this facility tomorrow, the department would find ways to discredit the exposure and ensure we stayed buried. They'd move us to another facility or process us through the criminal justice system on manufactured charges, or simply eliminate us as security risks who knew too much." "So what are you telling me?" I asked. "That I should just accept this, sign the papers, and become complicit?" "I'm telling you that David is offering you a false binary. He wants you to believe the choice is between signing his promotion papers or joining us in these cells. But there's a third option he's not mentioning because it's the only one he actually fears." "What option?" I asked, though David's expression had already shifted, the calm certainty replaced by something more alert, more concerned. "Exposure that doesn't come from within," Catherine said. "Documentation that reaches people outside the department's control before they can intercept it. evidence distributed broadly enough that discrediting it becomes impossible. The facility has survived internal exposure attempts because those attempts followed predictable patterns, going to supervisors, contacting internal affairs, reaching out to local oversight. But it hasn't faced exposure that bypasses all of those compromised channels. "That's a fantasy," said David, his voice harder now. "Any exposure attempt requires evidence, and any evidence leaves the facility through channels we monitor. You can't distribute what you can't remove, and you can't remove what we control access to." "Unless the evidence is already removed," I said slowly, understanding what Catherine was suggesting, "unless someone documented this facility and distributed that documentation before revealing they knew about it."
"Which you haven't done," David said. "You discovered this place hours ago. You've had no opportunity to document it or distribute anything. Your phone has been monitored since you entered the basement. We track all communications from officers who access restricted areas. You've taken no photographs, no recordings, no evidence except your own testimony that could be discredited the moment you tried to use it." The systematic thoroughness of the facility's security protocols became clear. They didn't just imprison people who threatened exposure, they prevented evidence from being created in the first place by monitoring access, controlling technology, and ensuring that discovery happened in isolation without opportunity for documentation. "So that's it?" I said. "I either sign the promotion papers or spend the rest of my life in a cell because you've made it impossible to expose this place?" "I've made it survivable to work within this institution, despite its flaws," David corrected. "That's different from making exposure impossible. It's making cooperation preferable. You can choose futile resistance that destroys you and accomplishes nothing, or you can choose pragmatic adaptation that allows you to continue being an effective officer while maintaining security around one aspect of the department's operations you disagree with." Marcus spoke from the back of the room, his voice carrying exhaustion and something that might have been pity. "He's going to stand there making rational arguments until you convince yourself that cooperation is the reasonable choice. That's how this works. He'll frame your options until signing those papers feels like the only logical decision, and then you'll walk back upstairs and continue your career, and eventually you'll stop thinking about us down here, because thinking about us makes it harder to function." "That's not," I started to say, but stopped because I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "That's not what would happen? That's not who I would become? How could I know what I would become after making a choice like this?" David pulled the promotion paperwork from inside his jacket. I realized he had brought it with him, anticipating this moment. He held it out toward me, the pen clipped to the top page. "This is the choice everyone makes eventually," he said quietly. "Idealism or survival, justice or pragmatism, individual conscience or institutional continuation. And everyone standing in this room right now, the detainees, me, you, knows which choice allows you to walk back up those stairs as an officer rather than a resident." I looked at the papers in his hand, at the faces in the cells behind him, at the systematic horror that had been operating beneath my career for 40 years. The weight of 40 years of buried lives pressed against my chest like something physical. 40 years of people who chose resistance and lost. 40 years of officers who chose compliance and survived. 40 years of institutional perpetuation that had absorbed every attempt to stop it and emerged stronger. I reached for the papers. My hand was shaking. David watched with calm certainty as my fingers touched the edge of the promotion form, as the pen came within reach of being used to sign my name to complicity, as the choice he had expected me to make moved toward becoming official. And then my flashlight, still clipped to my belt from the initial descent hours ago, came loose and fell.
The sound of metal hitting concrete echoed through the holding area, louder than the detainees breathing, louder than the overhead lights humming, louder than the screams that no one upstairs would ever hear. The echo rang and rang and rang, filling the space with a sound that meant nothing and everything, a percussion of metal on stone that seemed to suspend the moment in its reverberating noise. David's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to register that something had changed in a moment that was supposed to have only one outcome. The flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam cutting wild angles through the darkness as it spun. And in the silence after the echo faded, I knew what my choice would be. Not because the flashlight falling was a sign or a symbol or a moment of clarity, but because in that suspended moment I heard what the echo was drowning out, the sound of breathing. 40 years of people breathing in cells beneath a police station, waiting for someone to choose differently than everyone before them had chosen, waiting for someone to let the flashlight fall and everything it represented fall with it. My hand dropped away from the papers. David's certainty cracked, and the choice that everyone supposedly made became the choice that this time someone didn't.
The flashlight stopped rolling. Its beam cut across the concrete floor at an angle, illuminating nothing important, just dust particles suspended in stale air and the edge of a bed frame bolted to the ground. The echo had faded, the moment had passed, and everyone in that room was waiting to see what would happen in the silence after. David still held the promotion papers toward me, but his certainty had fractured. His expression showed calculation now, assessment of whether the dropped flashlight represented hesitation or decision, whether my hand pulling away from the papers meant temporary doubt or permanent refusal. I looked at the faces in the cells. Catherine standing near the bars with exhaustion carved into her features. Marcus watching from the back with eyes that had seen this moment play out before and knew how it usually ended. The older woman whose hands trembled. The younger man in the faded band t-shirt. All of them breathing quietly, existing in cells beneath a police station, waiting for someone to choose differently than everyone before them had chosen. 40 years of buried lives. 40 years of officers who had stood where I was standing and signed the papers and walked back upstairs and continued their careers while people remained imprisoned beneath their feet. I reached for the papers again. David's expression shifted back toward certainty, the calculation resolving into relief that the moment of doubt had passed and the expected outcome would proceed after all. My hand closed around the pen. The detainees' breathing changed, became shallower, quicker, the sound of people watching hope die in real time. I pulled the papers from David's hand and set them against the wall for support, clicked the pen, positioned the tip above the signature line. "You're making the right choice," David said quietly, "the only choice that allows you to continue being effective." I signed my name. The pen moved across the paper with smooth certainty, each letter of my signature committing me to institutional complicity, each stroke making me part of the system that had maintained this facility for 41 years. Ashley Morgan, Detective 1st Grade, Criminal Investigations Division, effective immediately. I handed the papers back to David and watched his expression complete its transformation back to calm certainty. He took the signed forms, glanced at the signature to verify it was legitimate, then folded them and placed them back inside his jacket. "Welcome to Criminal Investigations," he said, extending his hand for a shake. I took it. His grip was firm and brief, the professional handshake of a superior officer welcoming someone to increased responsibility.
There will be a briefing tomorrow morning, he continued, shifting immediately into procedural mode. You'll receive your new credentials, access codes, and assignment details. You'll also be briefed on security protocols regarding facility awareness, what you can discuss, with whom, and under what circumstances. Standard operational security that applies to all personnel with facility knowledge. Standard operational security for illegal imprisonment, protocols on living with complicity while performing legitimate police work. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. David turned toward the cells, addressing the detainees with the same calm professionalism he used for everything. Detective Morgan has been cleared for facility awareness and will be participating in operational security going forward. Her presence here tonight was part of the standard briefing process. You should not expect further contact with her unless facility operations require it. Catherine's expression showed nothing, not anger, not disappointment, not even resignation, just emptiness. The look of someone who had watched this scene play out exactly as expected and no longer had the energy for emotional response. Marcus turned away, moving back to his bed without a word. The others simply stood or sat in their positions, with their faces showing the same hollow acceptance that came from watching another officer choose institutional survival over moral resistance. David gestured toward the door. We should head back upstairs. There's additional paperwork to process, and you'll want to collect your personal items from your current workspace before the reassignment becomes official. I followed him out of the holding area, leaving the detainees behind bars that I would now be helping to maintain. The door closed and locked behind us with a heavy metallic sound that seemed to seal more than just physical space. We walked back through the corridor toward the stairs. David pulled a key ring from his pocket, different from the one he used to unlock the holding area, and stopped at one of the numbered doors along the corridor. Cell 3. He unlocked it and pulled it open. Inside, a man sat on a metal bed frame. He looked up when the door opened, his face showing the same fear response I had witnessed in the communal area. But this fear was sharper, more immediate, because David had deliberately opened his cell. "Officer Marcus Webb," David said, not entering the cell but speaking from the doorway. "Detective Morgan has been cleared for facility knowledge and will be joining command personnel with operational awareness. Her presence here tonight was part of the standard briefing process. You should not expect further contact with her unless facility operations require it." The man, Officer Webb, who had discovered this place 6 years ago and refused the same promotion I had just accepted, looked at me with an expression that cycled through recognition, understanding, and something that might have been pity. "You signed," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I signed," I confirmed, my voice steadier than I expected. "Then you'll understand soon enough what that signature cost." He lay back on his bed, turning his face toward the wall. "Close the door when you leave. The light from the corridor makes it harder to sleep." David closed and locked the door without comment, then continued toward the stairs. We passed Cell 2, Officer Sarah Chen, 4 years detained, and Cell 1, which David didn't open or explain. At the stairs, he paused and pulled out another key ring, this one with multiple keys in different colors. He removed one, a silver key with a red plastic tag, and handed it to me. "Facility access," he said. "Red tag indicates command-level clearance. You can access all areas of the facility, review all files, and participate in operational decisions regarding detention and release. Standard rotation for facility oversight is 1 visit per month to review conditions and approve continued detention authorizations. You'll receive a schedule once your reassignment is official." I took the key. It was warm from being in his pocket and heavier than its size suggested, or maybe the weight I felt had nothing to do with metal and steel and everything to do with what the key represented: access to imprisoned people, authority to maintain their detention, participation in systematic violation of every principle I believed the justice system was supposed to uphold. We climbed the stairs in silence. The motion sensor lights tracked our ascent, illuminating the path back to the official basement level. At the top, David pulled the mobile shelving unit back into position, concealing the door completely. The seam disappeared into concrete and shadow, invisible to anyone who knew to look for it. The basement storage area looked exactly as it had hours earlier. Evidence boxes, old files, broken furniture, forgotten space that no one bothered to maintain because no one bothered to remember it existed. Except now, I knew what it concealed. Now I would walk past this section, understanding that beneath my feet people were breathing in cells, counting days, waiting for a justice that would never come because officers like me had chosen to maintain the system that imprisoned them. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor. After midnight now, the station was quieter, night shift operations continuing normally, dispatch radios crackling with routine calls, officers processing paperwork and preparing for end-of-shift reports, normal police work performed by people who either didn't know about the facility or had learned not to think about it. David led me to an office I had never been inside before, larger than the detective bullpen, with a window overlooking the street and a desk that showed recent use, file boxes stacked against one wall. A computer monitor glowed with an active login screen. "This is your new workspace," David said. "Detective first grade comes with private office space and supervisory responsibilities. You'll have 2 junior detectives reporting to you, and you'll be responsible for case review and resource allocation within the Criminal Investigations Division." He moved to the desk and opened the top drawer, pulling out an envelope with my name typed on the front. Inside were new credentials, ID badge with updated rank,
Heavier than the badge I had earned 9 years ago, believing I was joining an institution that served justice. Heavier than 40 years of buried lives, counting days in cells beneath the place where I would now report to work each morning and leave each evening and build my career while people breathed in darkness below. The keys clinked together as I closed my hand around them. The sound echoed in the empty office like metal on concrete, like a flashlight falling, like the sound of a choice that couldn't be unmade. I had signed. I had accepted. I had become what the system needed me to become to perpetuate itself. And tomorrow, I would return to this office and begin learning exactly what that meant.
3 weeks passed. On paper, they looked like any other 3 weeks in my career. Case files reviewed and closed, reports written and submitted, team meetings conducted with the 2 junior detectives now under my supervision, performance evaluations completed, resource allocations approved, the ordinary machinery of police work continuing with the same procedural rhythm it had always maintained. I received congratulations from colleagues who saw only the promotion, Detective First Grade, Criminal Investigations Division, Private Office, increased salary. They made comments about hard work paying off, about earning advancement through dedication, about building a successful career. I thanked them with responses that sounded appropriate and felt hollow. My apartment looked the same. My routines remained unchanged. I woke at the same time, drove the same route, parked in a different lot with my new reserved space, entered through the same doors. From the outside, nothing had shifted. Detective Ashley Morgan, recently promoted, performing the same essential work with expanded authority and responsibility.
But at night, alone in my new office, after the station had emptied, I could hear it. Not literally. The facility was too deep, the insulation too complete, the distance too far for sound to travel from basement cells to third-floor offices. But I heard it anyway. The breathing, the movement, the metal scraping against concrete, the sounds of people existing in spaces they couldn't leave, counting time they couldn't track, waiting for justice that wouldn't come. I heard it because I knew it was happening, and knowing made silence impossible, even when actual sound couldn't reach me. The first week I avoided the basement entirely, completed my orientation briefings, met with my new team, processed my caseload, performed every aspect of my job that didn't require confronting what I had agreed to maintain. David didn't comment on my absence from facility oversight duties. He had explained during orientation that new personnel often needed adjustment time before participating in active facility management. Some officers prefer to ease into facility responsibilities gradually. Others engage immediately. Both approaches are acceptable as long as operational security remains maintained. Operational security, the euphemism for not talking about imprisoned people, for not documenting what I knew, for participating in systematic concealment while performing legitimate law enforcement. The second week, I received my facility oversight schedule, 1 visit per month to review detention conditions and approve continued custody authorizations. My first scheduled review was 2 weeks out, giving me time to acclimate to the expanded responsibilities of command-level awareness. I made it 12 days before I went back down on my own, not during scheduled oversight, not as part of official facility management, but late on a Tuesday night when the station had emptied, except for patrol shift change, and I found myself unable to focus on case files while knowing what existed beneath my new office. I took the elevator to the basement, used my new access card to enter the storage area after hours, walked past evidence lockers and file boxes to the section where mobile shelving concealed the door I had discovered 23 days ago. The shelving unit rolled aside easily. I had facility access now, was authorized to be here, was part of the system that maintained this space rather than someone discovering it accidentally. The door opened onto familiar darkness. Motion sensor lights clicked on as I descended, tracking my movement downstairs I could now navigate from memory. The air temperature dropped. The smell intensified. The sounds emerged, faint but distinct once I stopped moving and listened. Breathing, metal shifting against metal, fabric rustling, movement constrained by limited space, the sounds of human existence compressed into cells designed to contain rather than accommodate. I reached the bottom and stood in the corridor, not approaching any specific door, just existing in the space and letting the reality of it settle into my body. This was real. This was ongoing. This was maintained by institutional choice and individual participation, including mine now. The records room door was unlocked. I had clearance to access files whenever facility business required it. I went inside and pulled open the drawer containing current detentions. New files had been added since my last visit. CR 259863S, intake date 1 week ago. An activist who had organized a demonstration outside the station protesting police practices. Detained after refusing to cease organizing activities despite offers of financial compensation. Status: detained, non-compliant. CR 259871M, intake date 3 days ago. A witness who had recorded an officer-involved shooting and declined to delete the footage. Detained for protective custody, pending investigation completion. Status: detained, cooperation assessment ongoing. 2 people, 2 new names added to files that would document their imprisonment until they either signed agreements promising silence or remained detained until natural expiration. I closed the drawer and opened the one containing archive storage, pulled a file at random from the Resolved section. CR 893421J, a journalist who had been investigating corruption, detained in 1989, released in 1992 after signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The file contained quarterly evaluation reports documenting her psychological deterioration over 3 years of captivity, initial defiance giving way to depression, depression giving way to resignation, resignation giving way to compliance. The final evaluation noted, subject demonstrates adequate cooperation and no longer poses security risk. Recommend release with standard financial settlement and relocation requirement. 3 years of imprisonment to break someone's resistance enough that they signed papers promising never to speak about what they had witnessed or experienced. I returned the file and pulled another, then another, read through documentation of systematic psychological torture disguised as protective custody, reviewed quarterly reports that tracked detainee mental health deterioration as if it were routine medical monitoring, examined release agreements that required people to accept financial compensation for years of illegal imprisonment and promise never to disclose what had happened to them. The files were organized, updated regularly, maintained with bureaucratic precision. The system didn't hide its actions from itself. It documented them thoroughly, processed them procedurally, rationalized them institutionally. I heard footsteps in the corridor. My hand moved toward my service weapon before I remembered where I was and who else had facility access. The records room door opened, and David appeared in the doorway, not surprised to find me there. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone conversational rather than suspicious. "Reviewing files," I said, which was true, but incomplete. "That's normal. Most officers with facility awareness initially develop insomnia. Your brain keeps processing what you know while you're trying to rest, making sleep difficult." He entered the room and closed the door behind him. "It gets easier. The awareness becomes less constant. You start having days where you don't think about the facility at all, then weeks. Now I only engage with it when oversight duties require it, or when new personnel need briefing." He said it matter-of-factly, describing adaptation to complicity as if it were learning any new job skill. I thought about the 6 officers who had accepted promotion before me. Were they sleeping normally now? Had they developed the compartmentalization David described? Did they walk through the station without hearing the sounds I couldn't stop hearing? What if someone doesn't adapt? What if the knowledge doesn't become compartmentalized? Then they usually request transfer to different divisions or resign from the department entirely. Both outcomes are acceptable as long as operational security remains maintained. We don't require officers to stay in positions with facility awareness if they find it untenable. We only require them to maintain silence about what they learned. He paused. Though resignation after facility briefing triggers additional monitoring to ensure security compliance. Former officers with facility knowledge receive periodic check-ins and are subject to communication surveillance to verify they're not attempting disclosure. Lifetime surveillance for anyone who learned about the facility and tried to leave the department. The system didn't just recruit participants, it monitored them permanently to ensure their continued compliance. "I need to see them," I said. David studied my face for a moment. "The detainees?" "Yes." "That's not standard procedure outside scheduled oversight visits. Unnecessary exposure to detainees can complicate compartmentalization and make adaptation more difficult." "I have facility access. I'm using it." He considered this, then nodded. "You're authorized to access all facility areas if you believe
You became part of the institutional structure that decides we remain imprisoned without charges or trial or hope. Your conscience wants you to remember us, but your career requires you to forget us. Eventually, your career will win.
I wanted to argue, to insist that I was different, that I wouldn't forget, that my awareness would somehow matter even though I had chosen complicity over resistance. But the words wouldn't form because I couldn't make them true. I was different from the officers who had signed before me, only that I was newer to the compromise. Give me 6 months, a year, 5 years, and I would probably be exactly what David had become, someone who managed facility oversight as routine administrative work, who compartmentalized knowledge until it only emerged during required duties, who had learned to sleep despite knowing what existed beneath their workspace. The system didn't need me to be cruel, it just needed me to be complicit, and complicity became easier the longer you practiced it. I left the holding area and returned to the corridor where David was waiting. "Feel better?" he asked. "No." "That's normal too. The visits don't actually help, they just reinforce what you already know. Most officers stop making them once they realize that witnessing doesn't change anything except their own psychological comfort." He gestured toward the stairs. "Come on, you should get some rest. Tomorrow you have case reviews in the morning and team evaluations in the afternoon, regular work that doesn't require facility engagement." We climbed the stairs together. Behind us, the facility continued existing. People continued breathing in cells. Time continued passing in a space where time meant nothing except duration of captivity. At the top, David sealed the door and repositioned the shelving unit. The seam disappeared. The secret remained hidden. The system continued operating exactly as it had for 41 years. "You'll adapt," David said as we walked toward the elevator. "Everyone does, eventually. The human mind is designed to normalize what it can't change." I didn't respond. In my new office, I sat at my desk and looked at the key ring with the red plastic tag. Facility access, command-level clearance, authority to review detentions and approve continued imprisonment. The keys felt heavier than they had 3 weeks ago. Or maybe they felt the same, and I had just become more aware of what their weight represented. Outside my window, the city continued its normal operations, people sleeping or working or traveling, completely unaware that beneath a police station blocks away, a prison operated without legal authority or public knowledge, unaware that officers like me walked through that station daily, maintaining the secret through participation. The system didn't survive because people didn't know about it. 17 exposure attempts over 41 years proved that knowledge alone couldn't dismantle it. The system survived because of people like me. People who discovered the truth and faced a choice between resistance and survival. People who chose survival. People who signed the papers and took the keys and accepted that some things were too big to fix and too dangerous to fight and too embedded in institutional structure to change through individual action. The system survived because it offered reasonable people reasonable justifications for unreasonable complicity. It survived because it made cooperation seem pragmatic and resistance seem futile. It survived because it had protocols for managing exposure and procedures for maintaining secrecy and practices for recruiting each new generation of guardians. It survived because 41 years ago, someone decided institutional preservation was more important than individual rights. And it survived because every officer since then who discovered that decision had been offered the same choice I had been offered. And someone, most people, always signed. I picked up the keys again, feeling their weight settle into my palm like handcuffs, like cell bars, like the machinery of systematic imprisonment that I had become part of maintaining. Below me, people were breathing in darkness. Above me, life was continuing normally. And between those spaces, I existed,
Detective First Grade, Ashley Morgan, Criminal Investigations Division, recently promoted, performing excellent police work, maintaining operational security, living with knowledge that most people would never possess and that I could never disclose. The sound of breathing never stopped. Even when I couldn't hear it, I knew it was happening. Even when I compartmentalized the knowledge, it remained true. Even when I focused on legitimate cases and regular duties and normal police work, people remained imprisoned beneath my feet. The system didn't need secrecy. It just needed someone to sign. And someone always did. I had.